This is the Comox Air Force Museum, and we're located here at the front gate of 19 Wing Comox, and our mission is to tell the story of Canada's West Coast military aviation history. And of course, naturally, we focus on this base and the squadrons that have flown at this base, but we also include the history of the entire West Coast. Canada's single greatest contribution to victory in the Second World War was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, the BCATP, or the Plan. Very early in the Second World War, it was recognized that it was going to take a vast air force to defeat the Germans and the Italians in northwestern Europe. And it was also recognized that that flying training simply couldn't take place in Great Britain. So it was agreed that Canada was going to take on flying training. And if the United States was going to be considered the arsenal of democracy, Canada became the aerodrome of democracy. In Canada, over 130,000 young men were trained to become pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, air gunners, flight engineers, and wireless operators. They were trained in over 100 airfields that were built almost overnight all across Canada. The flying training was rigorous and it was demanding, and as you'd expect, it was dangerous. During the Second World War, just over 17,000 members of the Royal Canadian Air Force were killed. Fully 10% of those were killed in flying training accidents. Remarkably demanding. So the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan would take a young fellow from the prairies who'd never even driven a car, and 2 years later he's flying a Lancaster bomber at night and bombing Berlin. Training that can produce guys that can do that is going to have a lot of risks, and sadly, many were killed. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan didn't train just Canadians, though. Over half of the students came from around the Empire. So a very good example of the high cost of flying training, you take a young Royal Air Force officer, Pilot Officer Norris. He has come from England all the way to Vancouver Island to learn how to fly a torpedo bomber called the Hampton. So here he is, thousands and thousands of miles from the United Kingdom, doing his flying training. He's doing night flights out of what is now Victoria Airport in his Hampton, and as his circuits go round and round in the dark, he gradually drifts a bit to the side and ends up flying into an unlit mountainside and is killed. Behind me you'll see a piece of that aircraft, and we put it up to remind people of the high cost of flying training and the sacrifices that people made even when they were not in combat. One of our unique displays is the Japanese fire balloon. Now this is a weapon that was invented by the Japanese during the Second World War, and it took advantage of their knowledge of meteorology. It was Japanese scientists that had figured out about the jet stream. Now of course today everybody knows about the jet stream, it's on the Weather Channel. But at the time of the Second World War, the Japanese were the first to figure it out. And they came up with a theory that they proved that you could take a balloon and you could float it from Japan. The jet stream would blow it across, all the way across the Pacific Ocean, and then it would land somewhere in North America, and where it would blow up, and it would be an attack against North America. A remarkable invention, and over 9,000 of them were launched in total secrecy. The schoolgirls that were sewing together the panels for the balloon had no idea what they were making. And the balloon is filled with gas in Japan, and then it ascends as it will. But of course, if you just let a balloon ascend and ascend, sooner or later, it will just burst. So you have to have a relief valve, and we have a relief valve here in the museum. And it lets the gas out, and then down comes the balloon. When it gets to a certain level, it has little explosive charges that dropped off sandbags. It's lighter again, back up it goes, where it releases more gas. But you only have so much gas, and so you get so many cycles till the gas is used up. Typically, they got about 4 cycles of up and down in the jet stream as it came across North America. Now, over 9,000 of them were launched, and they got as far east as Detroit and as far south as Dallas. But the vast majority of them ended up in Canada's west coast and the United States Northwest, Washington State, and Oregon. The theory was that they would land in North America and cause a fire, burn the city, whatever. But the truth is, North America, even now, is largely empty. And they did very, very little damage. And the only people that were ever hurt by these were people who came upon them inadvertently and set them off, and these were innocent civilians. It's interesting that this weapon was basically a terror weapon. It was sent to frighten North America. The secret to stopping terror weapons is to make sure that nobody knows about them. So if you're on Denman Island and one of these landed, you would report it to the Air Force bomb disposal guys who would take it away. Then an RCMP officer would come over with the Official Secrets Act and remind you that if you told anybody about this, it was 10 years in prison. The war was on, it was a war of national survival, and the vast majority of people have never heard of this weapon. So naturally, we're very proud to have it on display. And I must say, this particular balloon is on long-term loan from the Canadian War Museum. And I must thank them for loaning it to us. Well, as a historian, history comes from primary historical documents. They're actually written by a human being, and that forms the very basis of history. Here in our museum, we're very proud. In fact, our single most important document is called the Caldwell Diary. Now, John Caldwell was a navigator from Victoria, and he was on a bomber that was shot down in the Second World War. He was taken as a prisoner of war to Stalag Luft 3. This was a prisoner of war camp run by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and they kept aviation prisoners there. This was the famous prison camp from which the Great Escape was conducted. Now, what makes our part important is that John Caldwell kept the diary of the Great Escape. And here in the museum, we have that actual diary donated to us by his family. Now, as we go through the diary, you'll get the insights into life of a prisoner of war camp. For example, what was coming in Red Cross packages, what they called the guards, what they called each other, these sort of human things. But there's also the diagrams and story of the mechanisms of the Great Escape, of how they dug under the stoves and how they moved the dirt out and how they had little trolleys as the guys crawled backwards and forwards to dig out this tunnel. Now, Stalag Luft 3 was created to be a very hard to escape from prisoner of war camp, and not least of which that the soil that they had to dig through was extremely sandy and would cave in. And so as they built these tunnels, they had to be reinforced or shored up, as they say in the mining world. They had to use little pieces of wood taken from their beds to hold the tunnels up. Most recently, there was a documentary done where they went out to the actual site of Stalag Luft 3, and modern people tried to dig the tunnels to see if it could be done. And halfway through the production, they stopped because it was too dangerous, which is incredible that men working with things they scavenged from their rations under watch of enemy guards were able to achieve this. And it's interesting, if you watch the movie, you'll see all these famous Americans in it. There were actually no Americans in the Great Escape. That's no discredit to them, but there weren't Americans in that camp. Well, here at the museum, we have a variety of activities that I call our lines of business. And of course, our first line of business is the museum proper, the classic museum exhibits with volunteers to tell you what the exhibits show. And that's what most people think of as a museum. But there's a lot more to our museum than that. We have our library, and we have over 8,000 books, all aviation related, and it's a reference library. And so any member of the public is welcome to come in, sit down, and do their research. But that's kind of classic reference. There's the other part that I call the personal reference, and I call this our noble work.
And a guy came in just the other day, and he's donated these, and it looks like the standard set of World War II medals, and there's a couple of documents in there. What I'd like you
The best example is somebody comes into the front door with a cigar box full of Grandpa's medals from World War II. And they said, we have these medals, they're part of our family's heritage, but none of us served in the military, we have no idea what they are. So then we take this box of medals, a volunteer sits down, pulls the references from our library, and we start going through the medals. And then from the medals, you can create the story. This man had a Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, so we know that he went down and joined up during the Second World War. It has a bar on it with a maple leaf. It shows that he went overseas. And as each medal came from each campaign, we can piece together Grandpa's service. And it's important work. We do it. It's a great joy.
I found it in Zweibrücken, Germany. My dad was over there from 62 to 65.
Oh, you had it for that long?
Yeah,
We've been collecting stuff since 1988, so we've only in the last few years, we've been trying to create an archive that people can come in and ask for a specific thing and you can actually find it for them. And that's what we're working at. Everything that we have, there's 3 or 4 different teams that work on different items, books, photographs, artifacts. Bring them all together and put them in one central location, so the guy that comes in the door, you can answer his question about, you know, whatever it is, whether
and
it's
so a big part of that is you're trying to create a database on a computer.
Absolutely.
So that
absolutely.
it's totally accessible.
That's right. And create it in such a way that the next person that comes through the door can access it. It shouldn't be so difficult that only one guy can use the database.
And that's the challenge.
Yeah, it is a challenge.
And you have a lot of photographs to archive.
Oh, thousands. Absolute thousands.
We have over 40 volunteers who come down and are regularly scheduled to do the work. They conduct the tours, they help build the displays, they run the library, they do the research, they work on our heritage aircraft collection, repainting and refurbishing them.
So that's down far enough?
Yeah, that's good.
How about on this panel? Does this have to be sanded anymore, or are we done?
No, that's smooth and all that sort of stuff.
Okay. And how about the stuff up around the canopy? Are we going to be able to do anything to the glass? Are we going to polish it out, or do we just have to clean it?
Just have to leave it, and there's just dust on it from sanding.
From the sanding.
So the real work is done by all the volunteers. I'm here as a coordinator and too often just a cheerleader, encouraging them. Remember, this base was built as a training base to train multi-engine pilots for part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Victory in the Second World War meant that the base was no longer required. So the base was shut at the end of the war, and it was supposed to be peace. Early in the 1950s, this base was reopened to defend Canada from 2 Cold War threats. The first one being the Russian nuclear-powered submarines with nuclear missiles on board off our shores, so patrol aircraft would be looking for those. The other threat to North America that this base defended us from was the manned Russian bomber that would have come over the North Pole carrying nuclear bombs. And the defense for that was interceptor aircraft, initially the CF-100 Canuck, and then later the CF-101 Voodoo. And the Canucks arrived here in 1954 and were replaced in 1960 by the Voodoo. And the Voodoo, for me, is an iconic airplane for CFB Comox. Because for over 20 years, the Voodoos were here. And they sat the NORAD alert mission, which means armed airplanes are ready to go at a moment's notice. Now, what makes this unique is that Canada and Canadians didn't realize they were being protected by nuclear weapons. Now, the United States, it's a civilian agency that actually owns nuclear weapons, and they assign them to the military for their use. One of the rules is, wherever a nuclear weapon is located on the Earth, it has to be guarded by American servicemen. So here in Canada, we're a non-nuclear nation. We had a nuclear-tipped rocket, the Genie, and because it was an American one, it had to be guarded by Americans. So here in Comox, there was Americans guarding their nuclear-tipped rockets for our Voodoos. And so naturally, in any great democracy, there's going to be concern, and there will be protests. And there were protests right outside of this museum, which was, as now, the front gate. But this weapon had a nuclear warhead because it was very inaccurate. The ground-controlled interceptors would talk by seeing the manned bombers on radar, holding the Voodoos on radar, would provide them directions to get close enough to fire. As they get closer and closer,
We're talking about the enemy.
the Russians, in their big bombers coming over the North Pole. And so they'd be in a formation of bombers, and so the interceptor would get the Voodoos close to the point where the Voodoos themselves, using their own sensors, radars, on board the airplane, would be able to find them. When they got within firing range, they would fire the Genie rocket, which would shoot off towards the manned bomber formation. But at the same time, the Voodoos had to turn away so that they wouldn't be caught in the nuclear blast. Remarkably hazardous conductive operations, and we were very fortunate that it never had to be used.
And welcome to the 19-wing Comox Heritage Aircraft Park. Here in the park, we have a collection of aircraft lovingly restored by our volunteers, and those airplanes tell the story of Canada's West Coast military aviation history. Behind me is the icon of the NORAD mission throughout the Cold War, and that's the McDonnell Douglas CF-101B Voodoo. From 1961 until 1984, the Voodoos, the 409 Squadron, were Canada's West Coast Air Defense Squadron. When you look at this plane, you can see it's 2 engines and 2 crew. Up front, you have the pilot, and behind him, you have the Air Intercept Navigator. Just below the navigator's canopy, you can see a large spotlight, which shows clearly that this is an air defense interceptor, because that light can be used to illuminate an aircraft at night to make sure we understand exactly what kind of airplane we're looking at. Behind me is the Canadian-built and designed Canadair Argus. It was built on the Bristol Britannia airframe, and Canadair built a fleet of 32 of these for the Canadian Air Force, and for 20 years it was Canada's long-range patrol aircraft. It was called the Argus because the Argus is a mythical creature of 1,000 eyes. And the Argus flew long, long patrols out over the Atlantic, out over the Pacific, and up into the Arctic, providing anti-submarine warfare capability throughout the Cold War, and long-range patrol missions, surveillance, fisheries patrol, search and rescue, for years and years. Flights were long in the Argus. It was my very first operational aircraft. My single longest flight was 18 hours even. The record, of course, for the Argus flight is over 32 hours, and that record was set here in Comox by a 407 crew. The Argus was the aircraft of 407 Squadron from 68 to 82, and they were very proud of the work they've done here on the West Coast, and that proud tradition continues today with 407 with the Aurora, which replaced the Argus back in 1982. But the beauty of the Argus was you had 14 to 18 guys on board. They were your crew, they were your team, and there was a very strong crew esprit. And you flew together, and then when you landed, you hung out together, and they were really your extended family. And that crew concept was one of the strengths of the Maritime Patrol Force, and it made the work extremely enjoyable. During the Second World War, Station Comox was opened to provide multi-engine training as part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. So young pilots would have learned to fly in a very simple multi-engine airplane like the Anson, but then it was time to fly a big, complicated, powerful twin-engine aircraft, and for that they were trained on the Dakota, which at the time was one of the best transport airplanes, and it has stood the test of time. As we know, Dakotas are still flying around the world in their transport mission. Behind me is the Dakota from here in Comox during the Second World War. What makes this particular one very interesting is there's a gentleman who's living here in Comox named Andrew Rice, and his family, his descendants, run Rice Toyota, and he actually flew this actual Dakota during the Second World War. So I'm standing in front of an icon of the search and rescue mission, and that's the Labrador helicopter in the standard classic bright yellow and red livery of search and rescue missions. It is a true representative here in the air park of 19 Wing's search and rescue mission. Throughout history, 19 Wing was originally a training base, and then through the Cold War was air defense and long-range patrol, and then increasingly search and rescue became a Comox mission. And the Comox search and rescue region is all of British Columbia, the Yukon, and hundreds of kilometers out over the Pacific. It's Canada's smallest search and rescue region, but it's its busiest. We have fisheries, we have commercial fisheries, we have tourists, we have mountains, we have desert, we have the Arctic. All of this and all the resource industries and all the travel means lots of people need search and rescue. And so 442 Squadron here in Comox is a very busy search and rescue squadron. Behind me is the Labrador. It's a classic airplane, and it has been replaced by the Cormorant. And so 442 Squadron here in Comox operates the Cormorant helicopter in search and rescue, and also the Buffalo, a twin-engine fixed-wing search and rescue airplane. When we talk to people who are not Canadians about a search and rescue region that encompasses British Columbia and the Yukon, it's hard for people to imagine how big that is. There is only one European country bigger than British Columbia, and that's Russia.
The Vampire was Canada's first jet fighter. So in the late 1940s, we took delivery of Vampires, and they were operated here on the West Coast out of Sea Island. So this Vampire behind us, Canada's first jet fighter, very, very important. But it looks very old-fashioned when you come and see it now. And because it's made by de Havilland, yes, it has some wood in it. Just like the Mosquito did, our Vampire has some wood as part of its structure, especially around the nose. But this is a very important aircraft in our collection. What we're planning to do is create a weather container for it so we can put it out in our Heritage Air Park with the rest of our Heritage aircraft. But the rest are all pure metal, and the wood in this one means it's a little more fragile, so it needs a little more tender loving care and protection.
There's not a lot of room in that cockpit.
There is no room in that cockpit. Obviously, Jon Ambler wouldn't fly in a Vampire. But, you know, if you go through our uniforms from the Second World War, you'll find that people of that generation were smaller. And all those fighters that, you know, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, they are not roomy. And the Vampire was certainly far from roomy.